Well, good evening. Welcome to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute poll briefing. It's good to have you all here. This is the first event we have done with the Varsity Theater, and so far I think it's great. What do you think? Yeah. I want to thank our donors. Many of you here are our donors, and without your support, we could not do events like this or polls like this, so thank you there. I also want to let you all know about the Jean Hurley Simon Scholarship Fund for young women who are interested in entering public service. Carolyn Snyder, I saw her here, is helping us to raise, there she is. Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to all of you. Some of you have already started to help, but we're putting that together as a major fundraising initiative of ours. A third thing is I want to remind you to please put your cell phones on stun or silence. The other thing I wanted to mention was we're going to be using some charts up here, and I don't know how this is going to work, whether people are going to be able to see it or not. All of these slides are available on our website, paulsimoninstitute.org. So if you want to look at them again, they'll be available there. I want to thank the staff at the Varsity, and I want to thank Conference Services for their fine work in helping us put this together. As I said, this was a first. It started with Dr. Pierman and I were visiting, and we want to be supportive of this effort here in this community. It's great what the Varsity Theater is doing, so we thought we'd try to do. We always are looking for other venues and new things, so we thought it'd be great to give this a try. So thank you, Dr. Pierman, for your leadership. Please let us know what you think of all this on the feedback cards. I'll remind people at every event we need those feedback cards filled out and turned in. I want to thank the staff of the Paul Simon Institute, John Jackson, Delio Calzolari, our Associate Director, Shiloh Deitz, and Charlie Leonard, who is not here but who still works with us on the poll. Also, Carol Greenley, our Assistant Director, and Carrie Day, our Marketing Coordinator. Pulling these events together takes a lot of work, and I always want to make sure I give them some thanks. Why do we do polling? We do a statewide poll and a Southern Illinois poll. We think it's important. Both polls are important for a variety of reasons. Polling informs the public. It guides policymakers. In our case, it provides a research opportunity for students. We allow graduate students to submit questions that they and then can use for their dissertations and for their thesis. Good, credible public opinion research. All our research is online. It's passed the test to be archived at the University of Michigan, University of North Carolina, and here at the SIU open source at the library. So we're quite proud of that. Real Clear Politics lists our polls on their websites of campaigns in Illinois. And we also produce Simon reviews with this. Go back and John and graduate students, student workers will work with this data to produce additional polls and survey research. And as always, we see questions and issues we could explore. This is not just about politics. We look at culture. Remember, Charlie, I think, had an all-time great question. He said he was observing how a form of greeting in Southern Illinois is to ask someone, "Did you get your deer?" And, yeah, and that's a way you have a conversation. And so we decided to poll on that. 25% of the households in Southern Illinois contain a deer hunter, and 1 in 5 got their deer. And we can track this over time. At one level, it's funny, but to go back and look at this over time, taste in music, other cultural things that we can survey about. This polling thing can be useful to almost any discipline in terms of measuring attitudes and then tracking them over time. So I'm really proud of the work that my colleagues have done on this, and we're really happy with the results so far. Just a couple other things about the poll. We really bend over backwards to be as objective as we can about this. We use a polling firm with no political connections in Illinois. Cell phones represent 40% of our respondents. We have a Spanish version of the questionnaire and a Spanish-speaking interviewer available in case we get a Latino respondent. There's no robo or auto dial calls. The samples are not weighted, and all our crosstabs are made public. We've also done work, some of you may recall the Jackson-Williamson poll, where we partnered with UIS to have their survey research center poll attitudes in Jackson and Williamson County. It was a massive poll, but provided a lot of good data about how people feel about the community and what they'd like to see. We worked with the Alumni Association. I saw Michelle Suarez here earlier. She was helpful in terms of trying to survey alums and see how they feel about Carbondale and SIU and what needs to be done. And just recently, just this last week, we were working with DE students using SurveyMonkey to measure student attitudes toward things going on campus. That's useful for them as student journalists to learn how this works, and again, provides us all with some kind of insight into what people are thinking. So we'll walk through this data, and we'll move it along fairly quickly as we can. We do want to save time for question and answers at the end, and as always, the four of us will stay here and answer any questions you have. So I'm going to start off. The Democratic presidential primary in Illinois. These are likely Democratic registered voters. Clinton 51, Sanders 33. The Chicago Tribune today came out with a poll of the presidential race, very closely mirroring ours. They had Clinton at 67 and Sanders at 25 here in Illinois. So Secretary Clinton may be opening up a bit of a lead. Here you see the one thing that's important here to see is 35 is Bernie Sanders' best cohort. And that replicates something we have seen in other states in this primary season. Sanders is really attracting a lot of millennials. On the Republican side, those numbers, we came out of the field just about 2 weeks ago, and later that day, Bush dropped out of the race. Ben Carson has since dropped out. So the question is, how do we look at this? Well, you have Trump with a plurality, and the non-Trump vote being split up. Now, today on the Tribune's poll, they have Trump at 32, Cruz at 22, Rubio at 21, and John Kasich at 18. So you can see what was the Bush and Carson vote has started to migrate to other candidates. It was interesting, something may be at work with these other candidates getting closer. It's 10 points in Illinois with only a few days to go. But nationally, the Wall Street Journal poll today has Trump at 30 and Cruz at 27, which is about as close as anybody has come to Trump in any of the polling that I have seen. So the Trump phenomenon is going to keep political scientists and old political reporters and junkies busy for a long time trying to figure this out. And I feel a little bit guilty coming up here talking about it because some of you remember I said Trump was not going anywhere. So why should you listen to me now? But I had a lot of company in that. Here, again, the demographics. It's a little bit difficult to sort all this out from afar. But you see Trump doing well across the board with almost every group. Here is something that was interesting that Shiloh put together. The Trump vote and in blue the non-Trump vote. That tells a big story. 28% of Republicans are for Trump, or in the Tribune it was 32%. That's 68 to 72% of the Republicans in this state want somebody else besides Donald Trump. Can they unify? What may happen as a result of Michigan tonight, you could see a scenario in which Rubio drops out because he doesn't do well. Kasich, if he does not do well in Ohio, it looks increasingly like Ted Cruz becomes the alternative to Donald Trump, which is causing a great deal of heartburn among moderate friends of mine in Washington who have to choose between Trump and Cruz. The Senate primary, Tammy Duckworth, huge lead over her two opponents. The Republican, Mark Kirk, big lead in his primary. This is going to be an important primary to watch. We did not do head-to-heads on the Republican and the Democrat. each other, a general election head-to-head. It's just too early for that. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Jackson.
Okay, as David said, I want to reflect too that we are very pleased to be presenting these results and to see what a great turnout of interested citizens we have in Carbondale and Southern Illinois. I'm going to start with the governor's job approval, and I've just dragooned Shiloh to help me because I didn't have enough hands and arms and everything to take care of my notes and this and that. So, yes, that one. You can see already 50% disapprove of the job that the governor's doing. That's half, 1 and 2. 41% approve. That in the jargon is called being underwater, and the governor is underwater by a -9. By comparison, in the statewide poll we did, this is over on the right there, we did last year right after the governor came in, he was doing better in some respects. That is, it was 37, 31, positive of 6. But more importantly, there were 32 who had not made up their mind. So obviously a lot of people have made up their mind in the meantime, and it really hasn't worked to the governor's advantage so far. But I concluded, and we concluded in the press release, that this is really just an indicator of how deeply divided the state is, because it's 50-41 statewide. Then in the area which you see on your left there, we, of course, always do Chicago, suburban, collar counties versus downstate, which is everything else. The governor is deepest underwater and in more trouble, I think everybody here would expect, in Chicago by 34-58, which is a net 24 underwater. Suburbs, really very close, and the closest of any of the 3 geographical divisions. 43% approve, 47% disapprove for a -4. And then we downstate, 43 versus 49. I'm a little surprised. I think that he's doing worse in the burbs in one way of looking at it, at least, than he's doing downstate. But downstate, it's right on the statewide average at 49% disapprove. So the governor does better downstate or better suburban, depending on how you look at it, and the movement has been away from him. I have a friend here in town who stopped me in a restaurant when I was eating out recently. He said, well, why don't you do Madigan? Well, for 2 reasons. We've done Madigan over and over again. It's always terrible, so there's no point in doing it. In a sense, and Madigan's not a statewide elected official, even though he has obviously statewide implications. All right, stayed on the right track or the wrong track? Right track, 84%. Wrong track, a measly little 9%. Wrong track, 84, right track, 9. That's pretty sad, and that's pretty bad. U.S. federal level, ordinarily you get the worst results at the federal level, but not in Illinois, because on the Illinois side compared to the federal side, the feds are doing much better than the state of Illinois. As you can see, right track 29, wrong track 63, still not gangbusters. On the other hand, people like where they live locally, and it's always this way across the country. Other surveyors have done these studies forever. The local area always turns out best, usually then the state and the federal, but we deviate on that. So, if you would. Have you or someone in your family, this is longitudinal, I'm sorry, I missed the longitudinal. The longitudinal story there on that slide is it's by far the worst it's ever been. You can see that pretty quickly. 84, see how it goes up, was rocking along there pretty steadily. And then I think justifiably in the last year to year and a half, it's gotten much, much worse according to our longitudinal data. And David was talking about our polls. This is one of the really neat things you can now do because we've been doing polling for such a long time. We have, 2008 all the way through 16, and we have a double one last year. So we really do have quite a rich collection of longitudinal data, and you can do some really good stuff on the analysis of that. All right, the budget stalemate next. I don't know, am I too loud or too low? Can you hear me in the back okay? Yeah, okay in the back? Okay, Beth says we're okay. All right, have you or someone in your family been directly affected by the budget? 32% say yes, 62% say no. I think this is sad and unfortunate outcome. I don't get to dictate the outcome, but the real answer is everybody's been negatively impacted by the budget impasse. They just don't realize it. In fact, almost 2/3 don't realize it. I think it's the difference between direct impact and indirect impact. It's what the economist Steve Kraft, wherever you are, call collective goods versus individual goods. And on collective goods, people get hit, they understand it, or on individual goods. On collective goods, if you're undermining the educational system and the university system and the community college system in the state, you don't realize it fast enough. And I'm editorializing, but that's what I think is going on here. I think also, and David has said this in one of our press releases, it's no wonder that the backbenchers, as we call them in political science, the average, ordinary, rank-and-file legislator from Southern Illinois, is not feeling the heat the way I thought they would and the way I thought they should, actually, because there's just not enough people there saying, yeah, I've been impacted. But those who have been impacted, I think their answer make a lot of sense. For example, 27% said they had lost a job or their job had been threatened. Tell that to the folks at John A. Logan and soon to be at SIU Carbondale. A similar equal 27% said they had been directly impacted by social services cuts. 15% said they had been impacted by cuts to higher education and MAP grants. There illustrates my complaint that people just don't understand. They've all been impacted if we're destroying higher education in this state, which I think we're doing. 10% cited losses to child care, 10% losses to the local economy. There, too, I think it should be 100% because the local economy clearly is suffering because of the impact of the budget crisis. Okay, Shiloh, if we could go forward. We've asked this one over and over again. What would you do about the budget deficit? We've had a budget deficit now for at least a decade. And we've now asked since 2008, what would you do to remedy it? Well, there's the old standby, and it still wins. 47% says if we just cut waste and inefficiency, everything will be all right. I don't know how you get over that as a people, but I think we should have learned that. Not the greatest answer in my view, but that's 47% answer. More revenue, only 10% say they see the need for more revenue, although somewhat more realistically, 33% say that we need a combination of both, which gives you 43% total are willing to at least consider a revenue increase. 33% of those want that to be coupled with cuts to goods and services. If we could go to the longitudinal, there you have the longitudinal, and it had been actually going in a pretty steady direction. That is, the top two had been going up and then down a little bit, but not significantly. Then it went up, well, significantly, you could argue, but from 42 to 47 on the cut, waste, and inefficiency. Then you get the both. Been going up, 32, 34, 33 is really negligible if you consider the error factor there. Really about the same, and I don't want to make too much of 1%. So about a third, almost a third now say both. But raising revenue down to 10% after it had gone up to 16 and 14. And we put out press releases saying last year that it had gone up 2 years in a row. Well, it went down again. So probably some of it not terribly significant, the stuff you get when you get different samples, but nevertheless, I think some interesting trend data there. We've also routinely asked about which specific programs and services you would like to cut. If you're all in favor of doing cuts, it'll be of some interest to this crowd, many of whom I know well, that the most popular, almost 50% support goes to cuts in state pensions. The whole pension crisis has certainly done a number on public opinion in this state. Maybe it should be, and I'm certain it will be cut once upon a time in the future, and 49% favor while 44% opposed. There are lots of other things there. I think I'll just turn around here and take them from the top. Well, let me take them from the bottom. Natural resources is next. That is state parks and services, 38%. Also hitting way too close to home, state universities, 35%. They've not been paying attention to what's going on at SIU, I'm afraid. Public safety, 26%. And I think these last ones are really quite interesting, and to me, when we first started doing this, quite unexpected, actually. Programs for poor people, only 25%. K through 12 could hardly be more popular in this state, 17%. And then programs for people with disabilities, 15%. So I think that's quite interesting. I had the longitudinal data, but they're so complicated, I thought it was really too much to try to present them. Let me just simply summarize by saying there is a story here of great consistency. We've done this very same question over and over again, and we get pretty close to exact same results every time. People, not even 50% of the people, don't want cuts in anything, or want cuts in only a very narrow spectrum of things, none of which will generate the amount of money the state has a problem raising. Which brings me to the next slide, Shiloh. Where would you get the money if you agreed to get the money? Now this has actually got some new stuff in it we haven't been doing very long. The millionaire's tax, those who make $1 million or more per year, by far the most popular. 3/4 of Illinois voters think that's a grand idea. Interestingly enough, a graduated income tax, which of course our Constitution won't allow and would require a constitutional amendment, 66%. Getting back closer to home again, retirement tax on income above $50,000, 54. The old standby of the sin taxes, exactly half want to expand gambling and revenue off gambling. We've asked again and again about taxing services. It's now at 45%. A new one, raising the gasoline tax, we only ask because it's now a hot topic, because it's now the way to fund infrastructure and highways and so forth improvement. That one's already at 32%. And then taxing retirement income for all retirement income, not really very popular. It's at 22%. So there you can see where your favorite, or maybe you don't have a favorite in any of that, where we are as a people of this state. I'm going to wrap up quickly on a philosophical note. Charlie Leonard and I have been doing these longitudinal things and writing about them now for several years, and we wrote one fairly ambitious paper and fairly long paper where we talked about the challenges of mass democracy. And we wrote longitudinal analysis across all of the data that we had. And we started that paper by quoting Walter Lippmann, who a few of you will remember perhaps. He wrote a great book. He was a great journalist, and he wrote a definitive study of American public opinion that was published in 1920. And he said in 1920, the great challenge for Western democracies is whether or not we will rise to the challenge of authoritarian regimes. Communism, the Nazi threat was already gathering, and whether or not we in the West had the courage to face what would be demanded for really preserving Western values and popular democracy. Well, I think World War II and then the subsequent policy of containment across many generations proved that the answer was clearly yes. The U.S. and Western democracies did rise to those challenges. There was existential threat to the existence of this country. There's not existential threat to the existence of this country, in my view, any longer, but I think there is another threat equally serious, and that is, will we as a people decide what our government should do? What are the collective goods and services that we can't live without, that we want as a people, and that our elected representatives go to Springfield and Washington and vote into existence? But that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is, will we then decide that we're going to raise the revenue necessary to support those goods and services, and will we quit buying the legend that somebody else will pay for it? Because we're proving in this state that that's not going to work. The state is in a mess because we have consistently decided we wanted more goods and services than we were willing to pay for. And that's a challenge for American democracy that I think we're going to have to grapple with. And it's one that our elected representatives have made a mess of so far, and we've continued to support them making a mess of that. Okay, thank you on those cheerful notes. Delio?
Hello, everyone. I'm Delio Calzolari. I'm the Associate Director at the Institute. After John's presentation, the only thing I can think of is, besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? But I'm going to talk about a basket of some social issues. Just a real quick overview. I'll be talking about marijuana, marriage equality, abortion, veterans courts, everything except rock and roll. All right, so my first slide here is we polled on medical marijuana. You might have heard this today. We've gotten some media. We sent out a press release in the last couple of days on it. We've got a bit of media. So we asked the question, do you favor or oppose legalized medical marijuana in Illinois? And what we found was a surprising result to me, 82% in favor, 16% opposed, 3% other don't know. So why did we ask this question? Well, it's an interesting topic because it's an important public policy issue that's actually kind of in flux in our state. There's a little bit of political football played with this issue of late. A bill was signed in 2013 that authorized a 4-year pilot program. So we are currently under a 4-year medical cannabis pilot program in this state. It's going to expire in a few years. And then at the end of the last governor's term, when they were at a point where they were supposed to be authorizing who basically can grow and dispense medical cannabis, the governor did not follow through and do that, leaving that for the next governor, which, whatever the reasons might be, it's an interesting position to put the current governor in, because you're automatically on day one in a position to say no to a bunch of people that are interested in going into this enterprise. So again, a little political football maybe. Then Governor Rauner authorized licenses and sales began on November 9th. But in the meantime, twice there's been 2 rejections into expanding the list of conditions that are covered by, or that can be medical marijuana could be applied to. The statement from the governor's office said it was premature to expand the program because it hasn't even been a full calendar year where it's been distributed. So that's why we thought it was an interesting issue. But one of the other things I want to point out that's not in this slide is this big chunk of 82% favor. Of that, not of that, but of the total slice, but 53 percentage points within here is strongly favor. So you have a majority strongly favoring the authorization of medicinal marijuana. All right, moving on to the next. This is so, and what you'll see here. The point of this slide is don't have to memorize it. There's no quiz at the end. The point is here. These are several demographics, and when we slice it up, and what you see here though, this is favor and oppose along all these demographics. You've got overwhelming support and very little opposition. Broke this down a little bit more. That last chart, this is just a breakout of that, just to get a little bit better of a flavor. And if you look at the city of Chicago, you're at 90%, and you're 81, 78% amongst the rest of the state. But still, out here in our neck of the woods, downstate, we're still sitting at 78% support. And then, when we break it down by age, now this might not be a shock, but younger than 35-year-old, our millennials are at 90% support. These are all within the margin of error, so about 80% support, and the other groups older than millennials. So, but it's interesting. I want to point out too, one interesting little. If this dip here is legitimate, that actually, even though it's within our margin of error, maybe it dips down a little bit, maybe these dip up a little bit. It'd be interesting. This is the Generation X. So that's my generation. So I grew up in the '80s and commemorating the First Lady who just passed, Nancy Reagan. I grew up in the say no to drugs generation. And I'm wondering if that had any influence, because drugs were lumped into one big basket. Say no to drugs, period. And that's what you were taught in your formative years. So maybe that'll pan out in the future where we'll be able to get more specific numbers to understand that a little bit better, if it is in fact a difference there. Political party. So looking at the political party, there's a difference, significant difference between Democrats and Republicans, and it's one of those issues where independents fall between. And it is a significant difference, but we're still talking 3/4 of Republicans, who are the ones that favor it the least, are in favor. Next up, we polled on recreational marijuana. We wanted to make the distinction between medicinal and recreational. A lot of polls, when researching this question initially, looking back at other poll questions that have been asked by other institutions, either nationally or in other states, a lot of them just lumped it into legalized marijuana, which has different gradations, at least, recreational, medicinal, even the conversation about decriminalization could be a different conversation. So we wanted to add more information to that conversation. So this is our results on recreational marijuana. But the question was, do you think recreational use of marijuana should be made legal or not? And also the debate on this is also changing as well, as is the law. Currently 4 states have legalized recreational marijuana. And the most interesting difference we saw here is, from the last slide, is the no, not legal, 51%. So a majority, or half, let's say, within the margin of error. So about half the population do not want legalized marijuana. 45%, though, a close second, is asking for legalized marijuana, would support legalized marijuana. Distinctly different from our medicinal marijuana results, which tells us something else. Tells us that people are viewing these as 2 separate issues, which I don't think was the case maybe a decade ago. Again, going back to the say no to drugs blanket. And this is similar to the other slide I showed you with all the demographics broken out. But and this one's a little more of a mixed bag than that last slide. That last slide was leaning heavily toward my colleagues here, and then the other one, I didn't have many bars on this side, but this one's pretty well balanced. So if we look at region, yes, legal for recreational, this part of the state, or the rural areas of the state, they're about 1/3. Chicago is, as I like to think of it, if the state decided to turn it over to the cities and say, okay, you make your own decision, I think Chicago would probably have an incentive to go ahead and legalize recreational marijuana. But maybe that's the way, maybe if they did do that, they could find a way out of their police retirement, fire retirement mess, or pay back people for the spotlight cameras that they have to refund all their money to if they were to tax it. This is age breakout. Again, we see our younger folks pulling out ahead. And then you see the next couple categories, they're about half. And then where it really takes a dip here is 66 and older. I thought this might be a little bit higher because a lot of folks over 66 are retired and, they have a lot of time on their hands, but these were our results. But for those folks who do want to see a sea change in this, I would say just give it time. All right, and then political party. We dove into that as well. You see a distinct difference between the parties, 20 points as far as favoring, and then another 20 some odd points as far as not legal. So it was interesting, again, reflecting on the two sets of results from medicinal and recreational. Very different results across the board. Interesting topic to talk about and to look into. The next issue I'm going to talk about is abortion. Most people came back, wrong way. Most support for, a plurality of support for legal under certain circumstances. And then we had second by legal under any circumstances, and then illegal in all circumstances at 15%. But another way to look at this as well, though, is who would, in at least any circumstances, this is a pretty big pie, 36 plus 44%. Or at least some circumstances. This is one that John talked about. We have a lot of longitudinal data in our repository. So this is one that we've been asking since 2009. Fairly consistent over time. A little bit of this variation all could be within the margin of error. You saw back here in 2009, there was a little different for legal under certain circumstances, and these kind of converged over a couple of years. Could have been outliers, or just could have been a trend at the time. But over the last since 2010, it's been fairly consistent. And then the next issue is marriage equality. The three options, this was a question of choose which is closest to the way you feel. So it was three options were presented. One, gay and lesbian couple, and not in this order, and the order was switched up to make the question valid. So gay and lesbian couples should be allowed to legally marry. Gay and lesbian couples should be allowed to form civil unions but not legally marry. Or three, there should be no legal recognition of gay or lesbian relationships. So we had a clear majority, or about half, even if the margin of error swung low, it would still be half, but otherwise it's a majority, allowed to legally marry in the state. Civil unions, another 25%. And then no legal recognition of relationships is at 16%. Again, another way to look at this is any type of legal recognition, adding these two pieces of the pie together, 53 and 25, you've got 78%. So, 3/4 of Illinoisans support legal recognition of same-sex marriage or same-sex relationships. And this too was one that we tracked over time. And this, unlike abortion, has changed substantially over time. Yeah. Back in, and in fact, it flipped. If you look at allowed to legally marry, it started at 29% in 2009. Some things I think I want to point out on this one, and I'm not suggesting a causal relationship, and I'm certainly not suggesting our polls changed national policy. But if you look at down the time frames, so 2011 is when Illinois signed civil unions into law. So you got to think, people are joining civil unions. Same-sex couples are joining civil unions. Then what the negative fallout from that some predicted didn't happen. So then you progress to 2012, where for the first time a sitting U.S. president comes out in favor of gay marriage. And we're still seeing that, 2012, we're still seeing that tick up. And then 2013, kind of a follow-on to 2012, President Obama actually addresses the issue in his State of the Union address. And then marriage equality was signed into law in Illinois in 2013, going into effect in 2014. And then 2015, just last year, U.S. Supreme Court legalized full marriage equality. Sure, we see a little bit of a downward slope here, but this too is in the margin for error for the poll. So this is a substantial change in a social issue over a very short period of time. Okay, and lastly, we asked, well, not lastly, this is the last one I'll be talking about, Veterans Court. I'm an attorney by training, and I wanted to, and I've worked on some veterans policy issues in the past and other jobs of mine. And we've been, the last couple of polls, we've been able to put some veterans policy type questions. And something that seems to be a conversation that's active within the legal and veteran policy area, the legal community and the veterans policy area, is the use of veterans courts. These are alternative treatment courts, much like drug courts. So the idea is, in lieu of incarceration, someone goes to supervised treatment with kind of the hammer of potential incarceration over their head if they don't complete whatever course they need to complete to rehabilitate, or at least try to rehabilitate. But there's a distinct difference between drug courts and vets courts in Illinois. The vets court statute in Illinois authorizes chief judges in their circuit to go ahead and start a veterans court, where a drug court statute in Illinois requires the chief judge in each circuit to investigate using a drug court. So a little bit harder of a hammer for the drug court than vets courts. And we're a nation that has been in conflict for over a decade, and we have a lot of veterans coming back. So this was an issue that we wanted to at least gather some more information to share with decision and policymakers. So, and also one of the things that, we are also a state that elects our judges too, so public opinion is, I think, important to informing this conversation as well. So what we found here was, we asked the question, some say military veterans charged with crimes should be processed in so-called veterans courts that could offer post-traumatic stress treatment and substance abuse treatment instead of incarcerations. Others say veterans should be processed in the same courts as everybody else. We think a pretty non-biased question, not trying to lead anybody anywhere. What we found was 54% of Illinoisans support special veterans courts. 40% says no special treatment or no veterans courts, and then we had 7% others don't know. Some interesting things that are not reflected in this slide, however, was pretty consistent throughout the state. I was anticipating a little bit higher numbers in rural areas, but it was Chicago 54% support, suburbs 53, and rural areas 55. So it was pretty consistent across the state. Democrats and Republicans, no difference. 57% of Democrats support, 55% of Republicans support. There was, however, a significant dip among independents, and I have no theory to why that is. 41%. So you went from 55, 57 to 41% among independents. Any ideas? I'm interested to hear them. And of course, like on the couple other social issues, the millennials led the charge. Or those closest to the age of service led the charge. 65% of support. Other groups varied between 51 and 56%. So, and at this point, I will turn over to my colleague, Shiloh Deitz.
Oh, you won't hear me if I do that. My name's Shiloh Deitz, and I'm a researcher and coordinator at the Institute. I'm going to be talking about this most recent poll, as well as a Southern Illinois poll we conducted last fall, and a tiny bit from an Illinois poll we conducted a year ago. So the first thing I want you to look at, this is quality of life in Illinois over time. As you can see here, pretty consistently, about 50% would say that their quality of life is excellent or good. About a third would say average, and down about 10 or 20% say poor or not so good. So it's pretty consistent, waving along. According to our Southern Illinois poll, in Southern Illinois, only 32%, so only a third, see their quality of life as excellent or good, compared to 51% in Illinois. The, plurality of Southern Illinoisans see their quality of life as average, and then almost a third see it as not so good or poor. And this is pretty consistent across all the years of our polling. Fluctuates like that, but about a third seeing their quality of life as not so good or poor. So next, we're going to look at possible reasons for that, things that Southern Illinoisans are worried about. So at the top here, you see 73% are worried that the rural or small town way of life is dying, and that it should be protected. 71% worry that their children won't have opportunities in this area and will have to move far away for good, potentially. The rest of the concerns are mostly economic, being able to afford health care for the family, dealing with rising costs at 70%, having earnings cut back 63%, and being able to afford to send kids to college 54%. So there's a big worry about the rural or small town way of life, followed by kids moving, and then economic concerns. And economics are probably tied into all of this. So next, we're going to look at something a bit more positive. What could potentially be done for this? So downtown revitalization is super favorable, let's say, for Southern Illinoisans. 59% said that it was very important, and that's compared to only 37% in the state of Illinois. So almost double in Southern Illinois see the downtown revitalization as very important. And this downtown revitalization is more popular among young people and the unemployed. So young people, keeping young people in the area, that could deal with that concern. And then for the unemployed, I think that points to some of these economic concerns, that downtown revitalization could be tied to economics, could also be an economic revitalization program, create jobs and even conserve the rural or small town way of life. There have been a couple studies that have talked about downtown revitalization, like the creation of small urban cores, however small, so urban cores, however small, that can promote the conservation of the rural environment because you're getting rid of sprawl, you're having some economic growth in that area, and also creating a nice place where young people and people of all ages want to be. So in a way, this is, something we could do, and also an add-a-hum for the cities that are working on this. And lastly, want to look at local products. So on that Southern Illinois poll, we said, thinking about a normal trip to the grocery store, does knowing that a product is locally produced make you more likely, less likely, or does not affect the likelihood of you purchasing that product? And as you see here, I'll point it, 77% of Southern Illinoisans are more likely to buy something because it's local. That's compared to only 58% across the state of Illinois. So local products are more popular among Southern Illinoisans. Let me see some of the crosstabs. If I recall, the local products across various demographics, but also really popular among young people. So just a small recommendation from this, I would say that downtown revitalization coupled with increase in local products could be a great way to kind of improve economic security for local people, retain the rural and small town way of life, and also keep young people. So kind of these two small programs could be a way, and then maybe we can get the quality of life up overall. And that's all I have. Thank you. We'll take questions now. I think David will field them.
Have I got some great colleagues or what? Yeah, love them. Okay, questions. What time? What do we?
Quarter till almost.
Okay, we've got a good 15 minutes for questions. Don?
This isn't really a question, it's a comment. I'm guessing 20 years ago when I was practicing, I retired about 15 years ago, one of the drug companies came out with a part of marijuana extract that controlled nausea, but that didn't give you the euphoria. And it just wouldn't sell. And I think that says a lot.
All right, good comment. Yes, sir. Carrie, over there. Raise your hand. Yeah, so she.
Accurate sample poll. How
Wait.
many people do you typically?
Use the microphone. Some of us have trouble hearing.
when you're doing a sample poll, how many people do you typically poll for it to be considered relatively accurate?
Statewide, we do 1,000. In Southern Illinois, what are we at? 400 to 500.
And then does a third party typically do it, or you do that here at the Institute?
No, we do that with a third party. We don't do that internally. It's let out for bid. Any polling firm in the country, phone bank is what they are, can bid on it. This is a state contract, and then we pick that based on their bid. We've used a firm out of Texas for almost all of these years, with I think 1 or 2 year exception, and they have no connection to Illinois political interests. That's very important to us. It doesn't add anything to the credit. The polling firm can be fine, but if it's a firm that works for Republicans or for Democrats, the results are going to be suspect.
We, however, select the questions and control all that.
Yeah, we write the questions, work on that.
Do you think people are fundamentally honest when doing those?
I do.
I mean, do you take that into consideration when you're
Well,
doing the statistics?
I do. I mean, there's going to be someone who's a crank or something who wants to play games, but you're
Right.
talking about a 20-minute interview. And so if somebody were, I just think they'd hang up or wouldn't answer. We have to make a lot of phone calls to get one usable interview. But that's one of the reasons why it's important to us that we do these with a phone as opposed to robocalls or touch tones. As Charlie would always say, you don't know whether some 3-year-old is just playing around with the buttons with some of these auto dial polls. But those are very good questions. Polling today, there are a lot of questions and concerns about polls and their usefulness. People are moving to cell phones. They're canceling their landlines. Most of us don't answer numbers we don't recognize. So that makes it more difficult for pollsters to do their job, which drives up the cost. But we haven't figured out a better way to do it. There's some work being done online, but yet even that is still in its infancy, relatively speaking. Right there, Carrie, in the yellow. Yeah.
So given that, how do you deal with the selection process? You know, the people who are willing to answer these questions may not necessarily represent the general population, even though you've got a large number in this. I mean, people select out, you know. I don't want to be a part of this. They may have some of the best, more insightful answers.
Yeah, that's always a constant worry. You know, I think going to both questions, though, is are these things accurate? Are they worth anything at all? And in every way that you can test that proposition, public opinion polling still works out to be remarkably good. And even though there have been problems and they're getting harder because of everything David mentioned, when you can test what the reality of the population is, it really turns out pretty well. And the other answer to that, Hurley, is it's not drug research, other than, you know, marijuana maybe, but it's not the testing of a new drug. It's within plus or minus 3 or 4, but it actually does over the long run work out pretty well.
Okay. No, I see that as an issue.
Other questions? Okay, a couple back there, and then she has one.
With the poll about pension reform, and you're talking about cutting pensions or limiting or different, is there any kind of differentiation between current employees versus, say, new hires? You know, if I have a pension that's said, you know, when I hire in and it says I'm going to get this as part of my pension versus, you know, changing it for future employees that are hired.
Well, that's an absolutely good question because it is the policy issue facing the state now. We didn't start asking it that way, and we have not done it yet. We just gone with the straight question. We may need to consider that, though, because it's certainly relevant.
We do have the kind of worker in the data, which might be interesting to look at, like state private workers. But Yeah, we don't have when people started working.
You know, and one of the things that'll happen in this debate is it will start to clarify, and you'll start to see certain issues emerge. I mean, should we stick it to tier 1 people and not tier 2 people kind of thing? And then we'll have other more specific kinds of questions we can ask. But that's a good one. I think you had one here, and then I want to go down here in front. Right there.
What was the margin of error on the poll?
3.1%.
3.1.
You had a question, sir.
Our Southern Illinois poll that she was quoting from would have a higher margin of error because it's a smaller group. And those subsets, what was the margin of error on the D's and R's? I want to say almost 5 and 4, something like that, because they're smaller.
Thanks,
Yep.
as always, for the presentation you all put on. On your longitudinal data, can you able to keep track of the differences in opinion between those folks who have been moving into the state versus if you can catch people who have moved out of the state? We've had such a significant population turnover. I don't know if your longitudinal data can catch that changing composition in the attitudes. And the second one, if you're going to do, was that public versus private employment question at some point in time going to be a demographic or a classification for your responders for some of these responses as the economic issues come along in the next year or so?
Well, we don't poll people who have left. Okay, if you're not in Illinois, we're not interested in you. We obviously poll people here, and we could ask, you know, how long have you lived in the state? I don't think we have that.
Yeah, I don't
cross
think
on
it's a good point. I don't think we have in any data that we've done so far, how long or did you just move to the state? And the problem is we have to do this in not more than 20 minutes. And so once we do the substantive stuff, then the control variables, it just gets harder and harder to get it in 20 minutes. That's a good point, but not one that we can really add very well. I didn't really understand the second. Did you?
We do. Is this one on? Yeah. Okay. We do ask in part of our demographic data whether or not people work for a private company or government nonprofit. We do have those two baskets, and we can extract. We could diagnose our questions based on those classifications.
Yeah.
Or you can. I mean, we post all this stuff online. It's archived at those universities. This is all none of this is proprietary. It's public domain, public document. We want people and researchers to get into our data and to use what
This is online.
the crosstab.
Yeah, this
and,
is available
and look
online.
At that's what gets interesting about this. You see how public employees might feel differently about some issue than private sector or labor union membership, for example. She had a question.
This might be a little off topic, but David, you were in Iowa for a little bit, and could you explain what's happening in the Republican Party?
Well, actually, it's related to polling. As I said, I didn't see this Trump thing happening. I thought he would have faded earlier. Republican Party's having a civil war. There's a fault line in the Republican Party that's been there since 1912 with Taft-Roosevelt, and this sort of goes back to that nationalism, protectionism, tariffs. All these things are sort of, they flare up periodically. You have the Tea Party Republicans against the establishment Republicans. That's what it is. And the establishment Republicans, the moderate Republicans, have not gotten their act together. So you may also be seeing the reemergence of the Reagan Democrat. Trump's supporters, white men, and he's been able to bring those people out to the polls in ways they haven't been in recent elections. So you may be seeing the reemergence of the Reagan Democrat and their influence growing in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is changing. Speaker Boehner is no longer Speaker because of this, and I think that the party is going through this change. I don't know what this portends for the November election. I was looking at one analysis today that said if Trump can increase the white voter turnout in battleground states that are predominantly white may be able to flip them to the Republicans. In Iowa, where I come from, 93% white. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, even Ohio, predominantly white states. If all of a sudden white male, non-college educated turnout starts to increase, then could those battleground states flip? But it's not that simple. At the same time Trump is doing that, he's offending Latino voters and voters of Hispanic ancestry, which is a group that's just skyrocketing in size. And so there's going to be a backblast against some of this stuff on immigration. And if you're increasing Latino turnout as well, then all of a sudden states like Georgia and Arizona start to come into play for the Democrats. So it's a fascinating realignment. We're in the middle of the vortex here, and that's my best guess as to, as to how this is starting to play out, just to watch it unfold. I wish I could see far enough down the road to give you a good prediction, but I learned already that it was a mistake to say you expect Trump to fade. I think I mentioned that Wall Street Journal poll today that shows him only 3 points ahead of Cruz. So is the non-Trump faction finally starting to rally around one? If they do, what will that mean in terms of the delegate counts going to the convention? Can Trump pile up enough delegates? Will we have a brokered convention is the question. And all that is still yet to come. John, do you have any thoughts about it?
No, I think I summarized it nicely.
Me too on that.
I've been wrong as often as I. So.
Carrie, we have a question over here. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Judy Cunningham. The bottom line on this marijuana and the courts for veterans is that marijuana studies have shown that it leads to use of higher drugs. And the way drug-addicted people get their money for drugs is by robbing, burglarizing, and mugging. My house has been robbed and burglarized many times. I was a hard-working registered nurse. Over $300,000 worth of stuff has been robbed from my house. At one time I was mugged in my house and held a knife held on me while the heroin addicts went and got my stashes of gold and my stash of Bordeaux wine.
Thank you. Good.
The bottom line is say no to drugs. Drug use is willful misconduct that's totally preventable, and we should not encourage this and supply it.
All right,
my friend Ariana Huffington in her Huffington Post said that she has proof that government officials are on the take from drug dealers.
Okay, we've got.
Say no to drugs.
All right, can we get some other? Perry over here has a question. Delio has a comment.
Last cycle, we also, in our last Southern Illinois poll, I actually polled on, one of the other questions I put in there was bobcat hunting, because bobcat hunting just went into effect. And what we found was even a majority of Southern Illinois liberals were in favor of hunting bobcats. That was a surprising result. I happen to know the director of the Humane Society, and he didn't like those results and contacted me, and he had a different position, and we don't take a side. We just the point I made to him was, well, then we just did you a favor because you need to do a lot more public education then.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. One of the I mentioned you do these polls. One reason you do them is to help guide public officials. On the one hand, it's easy to say, well, yeah, it helps a politician, test the wind. But this is a state also where some tough decisions have to be made. And it's helpful to everyone in the debate to understand how people stand, to look at the internals, whether it's the issue you feel about or budgets. If I'm a political leader in Illinois today, I've got a sales job to do if I want to convince Illinoisans that we're going to have to cut spending and raise taxes. I've got work to do, and it's helpful to policymakers in that regard. At least they don't fly blind in the debate. Perry?
Well, I've enjoyed this polling stuff as always. But John, this question is you and Dave and Shiloh and
I can't hear you.
Delio.
Can't hear you. Perry.
Okay, this is for all of you. The one of the most troubling parts for me of this poll, and it's not just this time, it's the idea that waste and inefficiency, or maybe corruption, I don't know if you use that term, that is the biggest item in the Illinois budget. That somehow if we dealt with that aspect, it would magically go away. And, you know, I've worked in public institution most of my life. Yeah, we've got a few people that could perhaps pick up the pace a little bit better, but the idea that it's that central to the whole state government, it just befuddles me. I don't understand that. Where does that come from?
Oh, well, you know, I think it's a failure of public education, and I've been teaching civics in American government forever, and I think I've basically failed in all of that. And
So have I,
have
John.
you. I mean, people don't know much specific about much of the policy stuff that we all are pretty into, but they especially don't know and understand anything about public budgeting. And they get fed nonsense during the campaign, so it's not surprising they don't know anything about public budgeting. We're going to have to do better, Perry. You got to go back to Logan and do better on teaching civics.
But we do know that levels of public corruption in this state are greater than they are in most other states. Some metrics on that out of the U.S. Attorney, for example, they say it's great. And so when people see what Rod Blagojevich is doing, you know, or a Franklin County clerk, they tend to think there is waste and abuse that's going on. So I think that question becomes kind of a vessel for people who have a lot to dislike about Illinois politics and public affairs. And you see that in the 84% wrong track, the low job approval ratings. That's my take. Other questions? I can't see very well.
Over on the left, just behind Perry.
Where? Right.
Just behind Perry.
Right behind Perry in the picture.
Okay, so one of the first things that came to mind
A
when
little bit louder, please.
So one of the first things that came to mind when you said a 20-minute survey was that a majority of my generation couldn't stay focused longer than 3 minutes and would probably hang up. So I was wondering, what is the age distribution on the data that you collected, and is that at all relevant to show why there were such high numbers for millennials versus low polling for older generations?
Well, we stay at it till we wind up with a representative sample of the age distribution. It works out in the long run, although you're quite right, it's harder and harder to get young people to sit still, and they're usually on their cell phone while we do it.
We got time for a couple more questions. Do we have right over here, Carrie?
This to change the subject a little on the small town America or what's happening to Carbondale and other cities like this. I don't think it's independent of the fact that about half of the top 50 richest people in the world are Walmart heirs, and the money that Walmart takes in, you know, it doesn't stay in the city, so much of it, to help the city develop and maintain a healthy life. And the towns that don't have Walmarts, now they don't have anything because the people that live there drive the 30 or 40 miles to Walmart and they can buy anything they want.
Shiloh, do you want to comment on that?
I think it's a good point. And I think one thing to think about in this, I mean, maybe we don't take the Walmart away, but start to implement that. In this area, there's so much agricultural land, so perhaps in the area of food, we start increasing the amount of local food, and that's, as you said, a small cycle. If we're selling local food, you know, the farmers in Southern Illinois, the buyers in Southern Illinois, so there isn't this kind of throwing money outside. And I think that would also improve people's health. It would give people more opportunities for healthy living, healthy eating, appreciation of the natural scape.
We are very much interested in that issue of how we bolster local communities, creative economy. That's why we're here. I mean, that part of in this venue. So I think I agree with that. And I think the question is, how do we look for alternatives? Buy local, some of these initiatives, fiber optic networks, creative economy. Those are things we can do for ourselves. This has been a great group. We've run a little bit over on time, so thank you all for being here. Thank you for supporting the Institute. We appreciate it. Good to see you all.